Thank you very much. I am not a Conservative backbench MP. I'm standing in for Lee Rowley, so it's a real opportunity for me to not be a keynote speaker as billed. So look, I want to talk a bit about the data market and the technology market, but from a consumer perspective. I was just listening to some of the comments about the power that consumers have to change the behavior of companies. And I think, and I'm a half-full kind of person, I think there is a real strong argument here for assuming we can get over some of the big problems stopping consumers exercising their power in the market, for that to be a much quicker route to change than some of the regulatory or legal avenues that you've been talking about. Of course, big companies and big data isn't anything new. Banks, for example, insurance companies have been examining consumers' data to work out the price of your insurance or your loan for many years. The difference is speed. There's also a lot of companies and organizations now who are obviously using data or trying to use data for good, from the NHS here to smaller tech startups. But if we think about the market, the data market as it is now, with a very small number of companies dominating it, a small number of companies using their dominance to stifle competition, either to buy it up or to crowd it out. If you think about the accumulation of very, very large amounts of data, unprecedented, and the ability of companies to use that, to monetize that, to exploit it, for example, for advertising, then we are sailing into very different waters. This doesn't feel like the dominance of banking, the dominance in energy, and in other markets that have classically been seen to be so failing that governments have felt they've had to intervene. And I was thinking about this also just from the perspective of mixed markets, of public services, actually. I was reading an email from my kids' school. They sent me a bulletin saying, well, first of all, click on Google to read the bulletin. Secondly, a lot of what they wanted to say was about how they're using Google for Schools, Google Classroom. And the school has just been awarded Apple Distinguished School status for its use of iPads. I mean, it is extraordinary. We used to see this with banks getting into the kids early and becoming part of their everyday lives in a way that makes them using their products in the future just absolutely normal. At the same time, by the way, that the school is warning of the dangers of excessive screen time, and I don't seem to have connected those two issues up. But consumer campaigns have been onto the issue of how companies are using data and technology to gather people's data for a long time. I've worked for a long time with campaigners and journalists who've been looking at smart TVs, harvesting data, toys, smart meters, and the like. But very often that was done from the perspective of privacy, not through the perspective of a broader set of consumer rights. And that's what I want us to think about a bit today. And it's urgent because with machine learning, your rights as a consumer can be so much more quickly trampled on. For example, it's very easy now to spot a vulnerable consumer, a consumer with mental health problems, and a bank could therefore, in theory, very quickly say to you, no, I'm not going to provide you with a product. An insurance company the same, an airline charge you more. Differential pricing as a result of the misuse of data is already happening. But we need to think about what consumers can actually do. And if you look at the research into how consumers engage with data and technology, you find, as in lots of other markets, in fact, pretty much every market, that consumers don't behave in a rational way. We all use rules of thumb. We all give priority to the here and now over the longer term. We are only vaguely aware of the consequences of giving away our data in return for something that looks free right now. And because of technology shifting so quickly, it's extremely hard for consumers to keep up with all of that. And in particular, for consumers, if you attempt to understand these issues, the complexity makes it even more unlikely that you're going to be engaged with it. There's a habit there that the more complex it looks, the more you will probably not engage with it. So there's a really big challenge here about how we help consumers to engage with this market of data and technology in a way that works for them, that gives them either the control or the ownership, although I'd argue those are two sides of the same coin. About 5 years ago, I sat down with the then Consumer Minister here in the UK and senior people from all the major tech companies, all the big ones. And the discussion was about, knowing what we know about how consumers behave, how can we get meaningful consent at the point at which a consumer is buying something? We've all put your hands up if you've just recently ticked the box that says you've read the 19 pages of iTunes terms and conditions before you could download a song or a film. No one is putting their hand up, and that's exactly right. None of us do it. The conversation was, you big tech companies are making liars of consumers by getting us to tick those boxes, knowing extremely well, knowing actually through their own technology, that people are not reading those 19 pages of legalese. We know that. And the challenge to those firms was very simple. It was, how are you going to make, as in other markets, very complex contractual relationships meaningful and for consumers to be engaged with those? And the answer, very politely, from every single firm, every big tech company that was in the room, that everyone uses every day, was, sorry, we're just not going to do it. And wasn't surprised by that, and I'm sure you weren't, but even when early on this was spotted by ministers, by governments that were starting to worry about the consequences of this, even in a narrow way, the answer was a very simple, no, we ain't doing it. So we've got to look at the limits of what's available through persuasion, through government action short of regulation. And we've also got to think carefully about what realistically we can expect consumers to do, knowing their behaviour and how people are, as I've described. And my argument is that what we need to do is to think about this not through a privacy perspective, although that's important, but through a broader consumer rights perspective. There are fundamental consumer rights recognised by the UN, kicked off by JFK in the 70s and written up into a set of consumer rights in 1980, that I think set out a framework for what we need to be aiming for internationally. Now, those include the following. It's the right to access essential goods and services, the right to safety, the right to information and education, although recognising the limits of that. Really importantly, it's a right to the protection of consumers' economic interests. One of the dysfunctions in the data and tech market at the moment is obviously that massive imbalance of power between the individual and the firm. You know, if you want to complain to Facebook about something, good luck. And if you want to complain to them or get redress, even better luck. There is a huge asymmetry, in part because people may not know that their rights have been breached. The UN Declaration has, therefore, a right to redress and the right to representation. So recognising that consumers need the tools to hold companies to account, to get redress when things have gone wrong. And individuals, people, consumers need champions to stand up for them, knowing that you need expertise to engage with some of the world's largest companies. Now, obviously, in the UK, we've got a thing called the Consumer Rights Act, and we've got a new Data Protection Act, but neither of those particularly well set out or describe consumer rights in that way. We've come at these rights and the ability of consumers to enforce them in a very piecemeal way. And in particular, if you think about who's there to enforce those rights for you, you've got the Information Commissioner or you've got trading standards departments in local authorities massively outgunned, hugely overwhelmed by the amount of times that people are having their data rights breached, where there is so many and such a changing grey area about the behaviour of tech companies. They're completely, and the companies know this, the big companies that may not have the individual interest purely at heart, are very aware of that. So enforcement is lacking, weak, extremely hard to do. Never mind getting consumers redress when their rights have been broken. So what I'm going to argue now is that one of the ways we need to give consumers power is by enabling them to get together to hold companies to account. And what we're doing at Google You Owe Us, and there are some of my brilliant colleagues sitting towards the back, lawyers, we're taking Google to court on behalf of 4.5 million people who had their data rights breached, collectively, meeting that cost by having such a large number. If you're one individual, you're not going to sue Google for their harvesting of your data illegally from your iPhone. And we're using a medieval legal route to try to find a precedent in court that will allow consumers to club together to be represented by one of their own without all of them having to be in court together. There is no court that would accommodate the numbers of people we're talking about. And surprise, surprise, we've had a first opinion from a High Court judge, which is this shouldn't even be allowed because, in his words, although people's legal rights may have been breached, some people like that. He actually said some people like a surprise party. And our view is very simple. If your legal rights have been breached, you should have a remedy as an individual. And that is an argument I'm hoping we're going to continue to have in court in the coming weeks. We'll keep you posted about that. But it's incredibly important if you recognize, as I've said, the limitations of what consumers can do individually, their understanding, their knowledge, even if well-educated about what's happening with their data. In the heat of a moment of a transaction, they may well take a risk, and they certainly may well not know that their data is being exploited and misused. So we have to find, and I think this will probably require a change in the law in the UK and elsewhere, the means for consumers to act collectively in court if necessary to hold very large firms to account. Finally, how do we get there? And I know you've been talking about this a lot today. How do we give individuals more power other than through the court? Well, we can't rely on governments or regulators to make the changes that we want in the short run. It's just not going to happen. Not least because you can see the relationship between the centre of government and very large tech companies is so close, if not the same at times. And I think if you look at, for example, the demands that Amazon have been putting on cities in the US for the beauty competition for where they might go with their head office, you can see that the power of those businesses is extracting more and more from governments, from cities, from regulators. They are not going to give that power up easily. I think instead what we need to do is recognize the limits of that and work with businesses that do get that there's a long-term sustainability argument about behaving ethically. It's not winning everyone all the time, but it's working out where we can get change to happen, who's got the power to make changes, who can most quickly affect people's lives, recognizing that governments are going to be so slow, never mind on an international arena. Then we need to get like-minded organizations together. I mean, I worked in the 1990s on the campaign to ban landmines, and it was a tech campaign. We used email. It was, at the time, it felt very revolutionary. We were talking to people all over the world about a single campaigning objective, sharing messages, getting case studies and research shared by email. It was great. And what I heard earlier on is about the different tools that we have available, Tech for Good, giving people power together. Recognizing, though, that I think people have started discounting the impact of 100,000 signatures on an e-petition. The bar is getting higher and higher and higher. When you are in the center of government, you now need to see a very big number of people involved to sit up and take notice. And then finally, as I've said, I think we need to creatively look at all the other avenues to give groups of people, consumers, more power in the face of a dysfunctional tech and data market. I know I would argue this, but I think it's incredibly important that we can enforce our own rights in the court. I think it's incredibly important that we can hold regulators to account, force them, if necessary, to take action against companies that have broken the law. But I think my message overall today is, and this is why I'm so pleased about United Citizens getting launched, is that this is a market, it's been done before, these kinds of dysfunctionalities, these problems have been there before in lots of other markets. It's possible to organise. We need the platform to do it, and we need the huge numbers of people who are now waking up to this to back it, to make the change happen. Thank you.